welcome along, everybody.
Hi there.
Mallory. We have Mallory, Mere Solicitor, and Jess. Would you like to introduce yourself briefly? Mallory, potentially?
Yeah, sure thing. So I'm a researcher with Trans Safety Network. I am not a legal person, but I'm here for the ride for the stream. I'll pass on to Jess.
Good to have you. Yes, you're muted.
Great. Well done, me. Hi, everyone. I'm a legal researcher at Trans Safety Network. I just finished writing a whole article on this case, which some of you might have read. And I'm happy to answer any questions people have about what this means for trans people.
Hi,
And Solicitor?
Hi, everyone. I'm a mere solicitor. I am not finished writing a horrific thread on this judgment. I got about a third of the way through and gave up because life was rather busy. I will get to it and finish it, but the judgment is inordinately long and there are so many issues with it. We're not going to have time to get to all of them, but we can hopefully explain some of the ways in which it's a problem, because it's one of the worst written judgments I've ever come across. We're not here for literary criticism, but my God, we would be here all week.
It is 117 pages, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's pretty long. I had a fun day on Wednesday trying to get through that and write a piece about it before end of day.
Geez, it's a bit much. That's a bit much. So here we go with the Trans Safety Network. Do any of you want to just to say a little bit about what TSN is and what you do?
Yeah, I can talk about that. So Trans Safety Network, we're kind of a group, we're an organisation who do research on organised harm targeting the trans community that can take various forms. It works a little bit like a hate research group, but in general, it's about looking for things which are a kind of threat to the trans community generally, rather than being focused on, I guess a lot of other charities are like taking up time looking after people's needs and caring for people. And one of the things that's become very clear over the last few years is the need for an organisation that is monitoring the opposition. So
that's great. And we've I've heard from folks before, but here's who we have along with us today. Mallory at Chicanery on. Is that how you pronounce your username, Mallory?
Yeah, Chicanery.
Chicanery. I've been doing that in my head for years now, and I thought I should probably ask. Mere Solicitor at True Solicitor, and Jess at Disabled Jess. So there's questions via the Google form, which I will stick in chat there, and has also been available on Twitter, which the folks will get to. But I have your slides here if whoever wants to lead wants to tell me when, and I'll shoot you forward.
Go for it.
Great stuff.
So just to give some initial context, Alison Bailey decided to sue the chambers she works at, technically not her employer because all barristers are self-employed, Garda Court Chambers, but also Stonewall, which I'm sure most of you have heard of. And she really did frame the way that she sorted her crowdfunder, asking for people to donate for her legal fees, etc. All of the publicity around this was framed as Alison Bailey suing Stonewall. This is still, by the way, what is on her website. I got this way after the case had been decided. So yeah, that gives you an indication of what the aim was around this litigation. It wasn't about Garden Court, it was about Stonewall, and the gender criticals were quite clear about that themselves.
That's fair. I had a question, and somebody in chat just completely destroyed it in my head. Sorry. Whoever wants to take that, run with it. So we have the victory.
Yeah, so basically, despite what you'll see on GC Twitter, Stonewall were found not to have done the weird, wacky conspiracy things that they were accused of by GCs and by Alison Bailey. I mean, Alison Bailey, some of her accusations about Stonewall were literally called a conspiracy theory in the judgment. And this is a quote from the judgment you can see in front of you here that basically says that Stonewall does not have the influence that it has been accused of having, that Stonewall law is not this magical, mystical Illuminati type thing that made the Garden Court Chambers discriminate against Alison Bailey. Stonewall acted reasonably. Stonewall did not try and induce Garden Court Chambers to do stuff. It just did what it's meant to do, to represent the interests and views of LGBT plus people. And in doing so, it, said that it had concerns about Alison Bailey's tweets and what they meant for trans people, but they didn't exercise some magical power over Garden Court to force them to discriminate against Alison Bailey. So the whole framing of, I'm going to take down Stonewall is nonsense. It's fallen through. Mostly this is a loss for gender criticals, no matter what you might hear.
It's really worth it. It's really worth emphasizing. I didn't catch much of the case, but I did catch a little bit of it. It's really worth emphasizing the degree to which what was being attempted was to try and paint Stonewall as like basically the gay mafia. There's like this graphic that they shared around that's like a adapted version of The Godfather, which I'm sure you'll love, Ellen, if we've managed to find it for you somewhere. Yeah, like with it's like the Godfather puppet hand with the strings, but with like pink nails on it. It's absolutely like classic homophobia stuff that was being circulated in GC circles that was like really heavy on the conspiracy theory.
Yeah, this is what was called the conspiracy theory in the judgment, that Stonewall is a protection racket, which obviously is not true, and there was no evidence of it that the judgment could find to support such a claim.
Those words protection racket were actually used during the case.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's probably next slide, I think.
Cool.
Yeah, so this is the reaction from gender criticals to the judgment. On the fifth tweet in Alison Bailey's thread of how much she won and how great it was admitting that, she lost against Stonewall. But despite that, she thinks that the judgment and all of the evidence she presented in the case still shows the malign influence of Stonewall, etc., etc. And Mayer straight afterwards saying that this means the Stonewall diversity scheme is going to fall through, that the trans agenda is finally going to be destroyed. It's quite a lot of what would be described as in certain circles cope. I think, and I mean, the next slide illustrates how much that they thought and believed and wanted this to be the case. The Telegraph, supposedly, broadsheet publication, its initial headline being a defamatory comment that says literally something completely, provably, unbelievably wrong that is almost certainly actionable. I'm sure my solicitor would agree with me. This didn't happen. This is a lie. This is a straight up lie. And it just shows, I think, the degree to which they are quite upset that this is not what happened, and that Stonewall, in a lot of ways, were in fact vindicated by the judgment, despite the poor quality of the judgment in other areas.
And there's been a very noticeable lack of. You wouldn't really get that. You wouldn't really get that idea. Certainly, scrolling through the various different headlines and even deep into the articles across quite a bit of British media discussion on this in the last couple of days.
Yeah, no, I think this goes to the heart of what I said straight after the full status decision as well, which is that primarily the point of these cases It's not the legal outcome. It's not the money won at the end. And it doesn't actually matter what the cases say. It matters what it's spun into. It's an entirely rhetorical victory, and it's a rhetorical aim to be used by gender criticals to further try and reduce the rights of trans people.
And it's also like, if you think about it, first of all, it's someone else's money. Like, that's the nature of a crowdfunded case. So it's not cost Alison Bailey anything.
Yeah,
And
Alison Bailey has effectively converted £500,000 of other people's money into £20,000 of her own, and that's interesting.
Yeah, it's I know many people here won't will know this already, but for folks who are less familiar, crowdfunding is usually the go-to fundraising strategy for most of these. Certainly has been for most of these cases over the last few years. Is there any is that particularly interesting to any of you, or notable?
Yeah.
I guess.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting because crowdfunding only really works if you're taking strategic litigation. So, sorry, looking at this from a legal point of view and a lawyer's point of view, crowdfunding only works if you're taking strategic litigation with wide-ranging future impacts, because it's almost universally not worth taking a case if you have to crowdfund it. So if you're incredibly rich and a billionaire, you can take any legal case you like and it doesn't matter what it costs. There are a few people like that who take somewhat frivolous cases on that basis. Don't work for them, they're terrible people. There are people who have to take legal action because it's their only option. And generally then you make a very clear value judgment based on, is this legal case worth it in the context of what I'm going to get out of it and what it's going to give me back? And that judgment is incredibly difficult, and a huge amount of lawyers' day jobs is actually telling people, don't take this one on because it's not worth it. You're going to lose. Even whatever the outcome is, you are going to lose because it's going to cost you more in time and resource and effort and energy and life than you're ever going to get back out of it. So that everyday calculus of, is this legal case worth bringing, goes straight out the window when you're crowdfunding it. But in return, what you're supposed to do before you crowdfund it is work out what you're going to get out of it for a community. So are you going to get a great legal victory that, for example, there was a recent case where a group of charities came together in order to try and improve disability provision and trying to use the law in order to do that. Now that would have major long-term implications in what funding was brought into a sector, and therefore it was worth spending more in legal fees than the case was worth in order to get something strategic out of it in the long run. With all of the anti-trans cases, there is a common thread of they will throw absolutely everything at every single one of them, spending absolutely just wild amounts of money on legal cases that were never going to be worth it. So at best, if Bailey had won every single thing she was asking for, she would have come away with less than a fifth of what she'd spent on legal fees. It could have been slightly more. She ended up having to redo her maths halfway through. So she might have calculated it as half her legal fees if we're being incredibly generous. You don't spend twice what a case is worth on doing it unless you think you are... Well, actually, I don't know why you would spend twice what this case was worth on it. It's inexplicable to me because I'm a lawyer, and I much as I like to be human, sometimes I am still a lawyer, and this is just not worth the candle, and it never was worth the candle. So yeah, it's very, very visible and notable, and it's notable in the way the cases are run, but it's also the kind of cases that they're bringing. They are cases where the only aim is to hurt trans rights in any way they can. It is wide. It's not targeted, it's not very well thought through. It is just, I can hurt trans inclusivity, therefore I will. And I don't know how anyone could genuinely justify that to themselves once they'd understood what they were doing. I find it inexplicable.
Yeah,
I'm actually going to disagree with you a little bit, Mir, in that I do think that this is strategic litigation. Right, it's strategic litigation, not understood as lawyers usually understand it, which is to set a legal precedent to change the shape of the law so that future, policy is positive for more people. This is strategic litigation where the strategic goal is a rhetorical one. The strategic goal here was to try and destroy the reputation of Stonewall. That was the point of this litigation, in my opinion. And I'm actually currently writing another article basically expressing this view. And I think that's why they're so upset, because they lost that strategic goal.
So it's like an advertising budget almost, rather than it's
Yeah,
less of a
exactly.
legal budget, more of a PR budget.
Exactly.
Which also comes in with like the way that the response to the way that your article, Jess, that you wrote for Trans Safety Network, basically saying, you know, this is not a huge deal. The sky isn't falling. There are some problems that we should look at, but like it's very measured in tone. And the response to it has just been people being absolute gender critical, people being quite furious and like acting like we're misleading people by suggesting that things aren't terrible.
Yeah, and they had the exact same reaction when I wrote the article in Force Data. They want trans people to be upset because that was the ultimate goal.
Can you, for those who perhaps aren't familiar, the Forsyther case, what would your elevator, what would your 1 minute on that be?
So effectively, Force Data won a case against the CGD, the Centre for Global Development, which is a think tank that she was contracted to do work for, on the basis that she took a load of actions, tweeted a load of things, brought some material into the workplace, etc., etc. They asked her to stop doing those things. She agreed to stop doing those things, to put a disclaimer on her Twitter account, to tweet less about those issues from her Twitter account, this kind of thing, to stop bringing stuff into the workplace. She agreed to all of the reasonable concerns. But CGD, without following any like proper procedure or social media policy, decided anyway to take the action not to continue to renew her contract. And it was found that that was discriminatory. And, you know, I think Mia agrees with me that the ultimate takeaway from that case is have proper procedures and social media policies, not that, you know, any action to cease work with someone with gender critical views is necessarily unlawful.
You would see the swan nodding, but I'm not able to animate it.
I think I'll go in and wreck stuff if I try moving the goose around. What about that?
Ideal.
There
So
we
yeah,
go.
like the Force Data case was one about whether originally whether gender critical beliefs are protected in the workplace. So you can't be sacked for having gender critical beliefs. And then secondarily about whether she'd been discriminated against because of holding those beliefs. And she won that case because it was found in a previous appeal that gender critical beliefs are protected, and therefore that was discrimination. So that one was very much more clearly strategic, because it was, you know, can we now say that this is protected in the workplace? That although this is another thing I would kind of like to bring into this, is like they always describe this, and you called this out earlier, Ellen, about how, you know, gender critical beliefs are simply believing that sex is real and immutable, and like I don't know if any of the other slides covered this, but certainly Alison Bailey said a lot of spicy things that were.
Yeah, I think later
I'm
we'll
laughing.
be getting into some detail about
fair enough.
the decision on beliefs in the Bailey case and how that is.
I won't take it off the rails then.
Yeah, not great.
We can. Shall we progress further to the next?
Yeah, let's do that.
Yeah, so this is stuff about the language and the choices made in the judgment, which, you know, I know Ms. Solicitor's thread goes into a lot more detail than my article did on this particular issue, because there is just so much. But if you're not legally trained or have experience reading legal judgments, you might not necessarily pick up on this stuff because, you know, you'll have no sort of idea of what the standard is and what's normal for legal writing and the kind of stuff you would or wouldn't include. But there's some really weird stuff in the judgment in a way that I can't quite
There's no justification
explain.
for it.
Yeah,
It's just it's yeah. It's
so
really weird.
it's really weird. So it gets to the point, and I make this point in my article, where I think, you know, this is so unjustifiable that the decision could be judicially reviewed on this basis alone. Like, forget the actual legal substance of the arguments made. Like, I think there is a solid argument to be made for judicial review on the basis of apparent bias, which I'll get to it in a little bit. But yeah, no, there's some fun things in the judgment. So, for example, the judge decides to include her own single paragraph explanation of the history of the philosophy of gender, which, speaking to sociologist friends, has become deeply upsetting to some because it is just so weird and wrong. But basically, it comes to the conclusion in this paragraph here. This is the end bit about what gender self-identity is. It was apparently invented by Judith Butler. So apologies to all trans people who started to transition prior to Judith Butler
Props to
publishing
her.
Gender Trouble, but basically you're invalid. I'm sorry, because you were pre the invention of trans people. And yeah, it goes on to claim that trans people who believe in gender self-identity basically believe that biological differences do not matter. That's a quote in there, as you can see on the screen. Obviously, this is untrue. Otherwise, I don't know why anyone gets HRT or surgery or anything. But I think, you know, it massively confuses what trans people actually say and believe and think. And I think it just underscores why a legal expert who, you know, a judge, shouldn't be venturing into their own analysis of philosophy and sociology and gender theory in a judgment, because it's just wrong and it's inappropriate. You know, I'm not going to try and explain things I don't understand, and I don't think this judge should be either. And it just sets the tone as being someone trying to take a stance, I guess, in a debate they clearly have no understanding of, and that's deeply concerning. And it means that then it sort of suggests that they're not analysing this on the basis of what the law says and what the legal issues are, but on the basis of their own rather political stance as to what their own personal belief of what trans people believe is, and what their own personal belief of what gender critical people believe is, and sort of weighing up the two. Whereas that's not the role of an employment tribunal. And I think it's a completely inappropriate thing to be included.
So there's been a question from the chat. Someone was asking to break down what's happening in this slide. And this is like, so there's 117 pages of this of this judgment, this ruling. And this is a fragment of one of the paragraphs from the ruling. It's paragraph 42. And it's like, for some reason, this ruling that like talks about that's fundamentally talking about the legal rights and wrongs and what factually has happened and how these things meet this criteria for making a legal ruling, suddenly stops doing that for like paragraph 42 and starts having like a conversation about what gender self-identity is and where it came from and gets it wrong. And it's like, so that's what's happening in this. This is a quote from out of the judgment. So it's saying, yeah, from this developed a philosophical exploration initiated by Judith Butler. Like it actually goes on much earlier than this. It goes back to like thousands of years ago,
Yeah.
we knew
I
what men
believe
and
it
women were.
begins something like, for thousands of years, humans have been able to identify the biological differences between two categories of people. It's just really weird.
This is
Yeah.
a Twitch chatter. This is a Twitch chatter. This is what people in Twitch chats sound like, is what you're describing.
And then it goes from thousands of years ago, and it works all the way to the present day when Judith Butler's ruined everything for TERFs, I guess.
In a single paragraph. It does the entire history of gender theory in a single paragraph, in a legal judgment in which it's completely irrelevant. It's just weird. It's odd.
Yeah.
Do you have anything to say about this particular bit, Mia?
Can you spell out what's wrong about the way this is defining things here? It's clunky, but what's wrong with it? So, like, what's wrong with it is it's kind of got nothing to do with the judgment. Like, trying to root this in history. It's completely unrelated to like employment discrimination law, which is what's happening in the judgment. I think Jess and Mia probably can speak to that like more technically than me, but it's like going through like a manual for a lawnmower and finding someone's like philosophical ramble on the nature of grass halfway through. It's almost cute.
But also someone claiming that grass was only invented 10 years ago and all the lawns before that didn't exist. Like
birds are fake. It's that kind of...
I mean, the honest answer of what's wrong with it is that it is a whole thing, and there is more problems with it than just this one quote, but it claims that trans people didn't exist until Judith Butler invented them, and Judith Butler's work only goes back to the 90s. So any trans person who existed before the 90s, of whom that's an awful lot of people, didn't exist because there was no gender theory to bring them forth into existence. And it's just nonsense. It's complete nonsense. I'm not the world's biggest fan of Judith Butler. I think that their work is amazing and I massively respect them, but I also find it very difficult. And there's a little tiny bit of me that doesn't care what the philosophy of gender is, because it doesn't matter what philosophy you use to surround people. To me as a lawyer, it matters that people are protected from discrimination and harm and are treated properly. Now, I am really aware of my limitations as a lawyer. I'm also aware of the limitations of a lawyer's approach to stuff, but a lawyer should know you don't get involved in philosophy unless you really need to. So what's wrong with it is it's wrong, like it's got factual mistakes in it. It's not what a good lawyer should be doing. It's not what any lawyer should be doing, because it's the wrong argument in the wrong way. And if you're going to do it, you've got to get it right. So it's the wrong thing to do, and then to get it wrong as well just exacerbates the problem and makes the whole thing ridiculous. A judge should be commenting on the facts and the law in front of them. This is not relevant to the case. It's not a summation of something that somebody has said. This is the judge's own opinion. This is the judge literally starting a Twitch chat or a Twitter thread and going, well, this is what I think. And it's like, I don't care. Like, we're not here to read your 115-page short story. We're here to read a legal judgment about what your opinion is as a judge about all the evidence that you got presented to you in the best possible way.
Exactly. It's unprofessional. It's inappropriate.
Yeah. Does that make sense? Because I can't see the Twitch chat because I've shut it. Cool.
Yeah, and moving on. This is just a flavour. This is not the worst stuff in the judgment.
Yes.
This is just a nice little a sample. Okay, so in the judgment, multiple times, the judge uses completely inappropriate language to describe trans people. So for those of you who don't know, the preferred, generally considered appropriate way to refer to trans people, to trans women, to trans men, etc., is to put a space between trans women, trans men, because it's an adjective, right? The same way as tall is an adjective.
Just to be clear, I'm just going to quickly jump in and clarify. This bit here is a quote not from the ruling. This is from the Equal Treatment Bench book, which is a different thing. This is like the equality guidelines for when you're writing legal text.
Yeah, I've not included the snippets from the judgment because basically it's ubiquitous throughout the judgment. It's not like one instance, it's multiple times. The judge chooses to use the language of contracting the two together, right? Which is usually a transphobic dog whistle. That's what it's known as, because it indicates that trans women are a separate category to women rather than a subset of the category of women, right? It's like contracting tall women together and saying women and tall women, as opposed to just tall being a subset of the category of women. There are tall women, all part of the category of women, right? So this document here is the Equal Treatment Bench Book, which is the guidance that all judges are expected to use to write their judgments, to guide how they behave in court and the kind of language and discussion they use. It's not binding. It's not something you can, challenge if it's not followed directly, but it is considered to be the tool that judges use. It's quoted in legal judgments, including the Employment Appeal Tribunal for stated decision. They quote this book and as part of their discussion. It's the guide. It's very well respected. But this judge has chosen to purposely use language which is not in this book, not just in relation to using the phrase like trans women, but also things like referring to gender assigned at birth as gender observed at birth, another transphobic dog whistle, referring to people as natal women or natal men rather than that phrase in again. It basically, I've included the snippets here that show where in the Equal Treatment Bench Book it's very clear about the language that should be being used, and the judge chooses explicitly not to use that language. And you can't even call it like an error or a mistake, because even just using because it's very deliberate, it's consistent, and even if you just use like Microsoft Word or Google, I've tried it on Google Docs, Microsoft Word, Grammarly, etc. Basic spell check it. If you put trans people as one word, like trans person, as the judge does in her judgment, it comes up with the squiggly red line, right? It's a mistake. It's not a word, as far as spell checkers are concerned. So this is a deliberate political decision, in my opinion, to use language which is considered not appropriate and not the standard in the legal profession.
And this is something you'll see all across, all across really every community connected to each of these cases, a very rigid use of language, a very caricatured, very choreographed use of language. You see that as well, like in everything leading up to cases, the crowdfunding, etc., and then in all of the responses, everything is very, quite oddly, sometimes similar. It's not something you tend to see. Try getting trans people to agree on anything. It's odd to see such uniform language around this stuff sometimes.
It's really odd to see it leaking into a legal judgment, which is supposed to at least pretend to be neutral, right? Mm-hmm. And if we go to the next slide, it's on this basis that, along other stuff, that the judge then slips into something that I think is by far the most indefensible thing she does, which is that she puts an entire uncensored racial slur in her judgment, short for Pakistani. And she includes that, and she says that calling somebody a TERF is the equivalent of that. Now, she does this without citing any discussion or evidence or explaining why she's reached that conclusion. She's just said, the term TERF is offensive. It used to be a descriptive term, like insert racial slur here, but it has become offensive. And I think this shows quite clearly, along with the stuff that mere solicitors explored in their thread, alongside with the stuff that I've just mentioned previously, that the judge has a very specific set of political beliefs. I believe that the judge is biased and in favour of gender critical views. And I believe that even if the judge wasn't biased, so factually didn't actually believe these things, the judgment is written in such a way that the decision should be judicially reviewable on the basis of apparent bias. If we go to the next slide. No, sorry, I didn't actually include the slide. That's not great. I will just explain it anyway. Basically, apparent bias is a principle we have in law and judicial review, which is that it doesn't matter whether the judge or any decision maker is actually biased. So it doesn't matter what they actually think inside their head. One, because it's really difficult to prove, but two, because we believe that it's not just important that justice be done, but that justice be seen to be done, right? Like, it's not just important that things actually happen in a fair way, it's important that the public think it's fair. That's one of the key parts of our legal system, is that we believe that people should, respect and understand and engage with our legal system because they think it protects them and they're, everyone equally, right? They should believe that the system's fair. And so even if the judge doesn't, personally believe in gender critical theory stuff, the fact that she's used this language, the fact that she's engaged in some of the choices she has in the judgment, including certain material, making certain comments, would suggest to the fair-minded and informed observer, that's the legal test, that there is a real possibility that the judge is biased. Doesn't matter that they actually are. What matters is that, that they seem biased, that they are apparently biased, and the decision could be judicially reviewed on that basis.
There was a reason as well why TERF needed to be a slur for the sake of the judgment, wasn't there? I think it was something to do with one of Bailey's co-workers had once said the word TERF, and therefore that was somehow discriminatory.
Yeah, so one of Bailey's colleagues, herself a trans woman, a barrister at Garden Court Chambers, had used the word TERF on Twitter, and that hadn't been investigated by the Chambers. And so as part of their finding of discrimination, which was based on the fact that they had announced an investigation into Alison Bailey, not that she'd lost work or anything like that, which was a substantial part of her claim. It was that the Chambers had discriminated against her by announcing an investigation in a tweet. Part of their reasoning in coming to that conclusion was the fact that even though Alex Sharp had tweeted the term TERF, there had been no such investigation announced into her. So it actually formed part of the reasoning in the end, which is particularly egregious. I don't know, Mir, if you can add to what I've said.
I think Mir's actually disconnected. Oh. Let me just... Are we here?
Hiya, hopefully I'm back. Sorry about that.
You're back.
All my plans for not having connection issues this time didn't quite work. I managed to catch most of what Jess was just saying. I think that Alex Sharp is the other barrister. She's absolutely brilliant. You should all go and follow her on Twitter. Just because her legal analysis is genuinely brilliant. Like, even if you're not following her because she's awesome, which you should follow her for her legal analysis, which is absolutely on point. And she's genuinely worth listening to on most subjects, if I'm entirely honest, but especially on the things quoted here. And her using the word TERF is really interesting, and this is like, no one actually complained about her use of TERF at the time, so there was no complaint, there was nothing to investigate, but that's still mentioned in the judgment later, and it's still, there's this whole thing about how TERF is a slur and the ways in which it's a slur, and it comes back again a couple of times, and it's all very strange that this thing that even Alison Bailey didn't complain about at the time, Alison Bailey, it appears, went back and went looking for something she could be offended by. And it's then used in this judgment as an example of less favourable treatment. And it's to me, my personal opinion on it is that it's offence farming. It's someone who's gone looking for everything that could ever have been said and gone, oh, well, look, she said something bad. And it's not, and it's in a different context. And even if if you want the actual legal response to it, even if now, today, TERF could be legitimately considered as a slur in 2022 because of the context around the word, it could not legitimately have been so described when Alex used that word when she did. Because Alex was using it at a different time. And, I mean, look at all of the things that Alison Bailey has said in the case. If there was a way in which that would genuinely have led to something, there is a clear indication that it would have been raised at the time. At the time the comment was made, it wasn't offensive. It's as simple as that. I don't particularly find it offensive now. It's something I don't choose to say. But that's more because I don't think that most people who could be legitimately described as gender critical could also legitimately be described as feminists, even radical ones.
I'm just going to answer a question from the chat. Should we be avoiding the term TERF in the workplace just in case? How does it work when some people will gladly call themselves TERF? My response to that would be yes, avoid using it. Not because I genuinely believe it's a slur, but because they will come after you and send you the turfisaslur.com website, and it's just not worth the hassle when the term gender critical is available for you to use, or the term transphobe, either of which is an accurate description of many of the views these people uphold. I also think that it's relevant. It's in fact mentioned. It was mentioned in the evidence. It was mentioned in the judgment that these people are claiming that they have reclaimed the term TERF, like the word queer, and they compare it to that, in fact, and I believe the judgment does so as well. So their argument is that, yes, it's an offensive term, but they can reclaim it for themselves, as we do with the term queer. I'm not going to get into a discussion of that because I think it is quite self-explanatory, and I think you can all form very educated opinions on the validity of such arguments. But yeah, I would just avoid using the word because it's not worth it.
Havachi asks, how long until they begin to call the term gender critical a slur? That ship has sailed.
Yep.
Oh yeah, that's gone.
Yeah.
But, you know, then we can just start using whatever new phrase they come up with for themselves, because they will have to have one, right? Like, this is how they collectively organise.
They're trying to make sex realist a thing.
Which is particularly hilarious given the political history of similar terms like race realism.
Yeah.
I think
it's very funny that they don't understand that.
Term they've come up with so far, to be honest. But you know.
Yeah, sex realism is an interesting one. Noticing it more in the last few months. It is very funny that they don't seem to know the history.
Or they do. Honestly, I think a lot of them do know the history, and they're quite happy to embrace the connection.
That too, probably.
Let's go on to next slide.
Sure.
Yeah, now we can talk about the actual law rather than the weird way the judgment was written, which is exciting. Another massive loss for the gender crits,
huge L.
which they don't like to talk about, was the fact that one of Alison Bailey's claims was that basically she was indirectly discriminated against on the basis that this is the way the argument goes. She was discriminated against as a woman and as a lesbian, so on the basis of sex and on sexual orientation, which are two protected characteristics under the Equality Act, on the basis that these groups are more likely than their counterparts to hold gender critical beliefs. And thus, because they're more likely to hold these beliefs, to negatively treat someone for holding those beliefs is indirect discrimination against those characteristics. That's the way the argument runs. But in the course of the case, they managed to prove that the exact opposite is true, that women are more likely to be trans inclusive, and that their gender critical organizations, most specifically LGB Alliance itself, are mostly straight run groups. So entirely disproving their claim, and telling us all in the process and giving us all a little giggle. The LGB Alliance only has about 7% of its newsletter subscribers are actually, which is how it measures its membership, by the way, are lesbians, despite it being, the LGBT Alliance. And if you do some maths, it works out that the vast majority of their subscribers are straight. So yeah, that really supports their argument that they're just here to advocate for LGBT rights and not at all a cover for a hate group that are, benefiting from charitable status with false charitable objects.
Yeah, the charitable law side of this is also very interesting.
Yeah, so there's a challenge being brought, I believe, primarily by mermaids with support of the Good Law Project that is challenging LGBT Alliance's charity status, because to be a charity, you have to operate in the public interest. And LGBT Alliance claim that they are a group that exists to advocate for the rights of LGBT people, and that they're primarily like a charity that exists for that purpose. But during the evidence given, they explicitly mentioned that the thing that unites them as an organisation is not these purported charitable objects, but is in fact their gender critical beliefs. So they
sorry, Jess, that's incredibly key. That's possibly, like, this is bad, that's worse.
Yeah.
Because that is directly in opposition to their stated charitable objects, which means that if that can be used in the hearing about their charitable status, that means their charitable objects are fraudulent, at which point I can't disguise the smile in my voice, because it takes so much to get a dodgy charity taken down. Charity law is incredibly complicated, is a whole different thing that we don't really talk about very often. But
just as a reference point, there are groups that openly do conversion therapy on people that claim that conversion therapy is a protected right to sexuality, who are legally charities, that they have had their bank accounts shut down by Barclays because they were too unethical, who are still legally hold their status as charities. So the bar is pretty high.
It takes so much to get rid of a dodgy charity, so much, but that actually genuinely looks like it might be enough. So if they've been silly enough to say that on the record,
under
oath in this instance, it's just, do you know what? When you're I know it's not properly Napoleon, but when somebody is making a mistake who wants to eliminate your human rights, let them. There are so many elements of this that are massive own goals. They're unforced errors, and they're massive own goals. And I hope that they rue the day that they were silly enough and smug enough to make these mistakes. But I'm not going to. I'm really delighted by these elements of it. Like there are bits of this that I'm worried about. There are bits of this that aren't great. I completely agree with Jess's article, and I think Jess has done a really good job of explaining stuff about the way that the weirdness of the judgment actually is important. But this bit's joyous. This bit's brilliant.
Yeah, no, I'm very excited for the hearing. I'll be watching live.
The biggest problem with that has always been standing. But the question is if this stuff is bad enough, then the Charity Commission then have legal duties to act on this as well as that hearing. So this potentially gives another avenue of presenting this to the Charities Commission and saying they have openly stated in court that their charitable objects are a fraud. what are you going to do about it? And that then opens up a whole other avenue. It's a phenomenal decision to have announced this in this way.
Yeah, the Attorney General is under a legal duty to ensure that charities are complying with their charitable objects and that they're not fraudulent and that charities are acting in the proper way. So
this is something that we like to do on this channel when following some of the terrible developments in the world is laughing at the self-imposed L's, and we are very lucky with these groups that there tend to be a lot of them. So yes, it's good to enjoy them.
No idea why LGB Alliance said the things they did on when giving evidence. In fact, a lot of it was very voluntarily given, and it's just very strange that they decided to do this, but I'm very grateful to them.
I think a lot of it has a lot of similarities to the other sorts of groups that Ellen covers on the Twitch stream, in terms of a lot of them have a very naive idea of, I guess, they're very optimistic about their own outcomes. They constantly believe that there's going to be this like apocalyptic rapture and like trans ideology is going to fall and that it's basically destiny and that they are the heroes leading the story here. And I don't think they imagine that, like, I don't think they imagine themselves capable of shooting themselves in the foot when they start.
A lot of these
when they're
people
supporting
are.
each other.
A lot of these people do seem to be coasting just on the vibes of everything, and it does tend to get them quite far. But yeah, it's whenever you get them, it's like anti-trans people under oath is one of my favorite genres, because there's always, it's the golden goose. Transphobes under oath is the golden goose that just keeps on giving. It is one of the funniest things in the world.
Yep,
Okay.
absolutely.
Right, we should now move on to discussing the this is the thing I mentioned before, and you can see the example I included, an example of what I was discussing earlier of the judge using trans women in this quote, if you would like. But yeah, this is them. So this is in the judgment. This is a quote from the judgment. Now, legal record saying, no, this argument's nonsense. Women actually support trans people in spaces and are more likely to do so than men. So, haha. Yeah,
Nice.
No evidence on lesbians being at any different disadvantage to women as a whole. Campaign group witnesses did not collect this information and relied within very small samples on impression. Yeah, we've got the vibe that mostly lesbian supporters. Great, thanks. Right, moving on to direct discrimination, which is the part that Alison Bailey won on. And yeah, so basically direct discrimination is where we're not looking at which groups are more likely to share certain characteristics and that the discrimination is against those characteristics. This is where we're looking at a decision was taken on the basis that of the characteristic itself. So here the idea being that gender critical beliefs are protected as philosophical beliefs and so are protected under the Equality Act as a protected characteristic. The holding of gender critical beliefs. So Alison Bailey's belief that sex is immutable is a protected characteristic. That's been held to be true pretty much determinatively now in various cases. So the key ones being Forstater and Makarov have both said belief that sex is immutable passes all of the relevant requirements to be a protected characteristic under the Equality Act as a philosophical belief. Right, so you can be directly discriminated against on that basis, and it's unlawful to do so. But the really interesting thing, and I think this is if we go to the next slide, is that it's not just that belief that the judgment held was protected. Right, it's not just that belief that sex is immutable, whatever your classic gender critical belief that Forstater held, that Makarov held. It was the additional beliefs of Alison Bailey, which I highly recommend. If you just take a look at my article, I've copied them out for you there. You can just scroll down to where that is and you can see for yourself. It's a very long section, but basically a list of conspiracy beliefs about Stonewall is how I would personally describe them. Right? Things like believing that Stonewall are complicit in the violence against women done by trans activists or whatever, under the tough as a slur stuff. Very specific, very narrow beliefs. And the judgment held, as I've outlined here, that these are protected on the basis that they fall under one general coherent view of gender theory as being harmful. Right, and as because Stonewall proselytize gender self-identity theory, it's part of Alison Bailey's protected beliefs to view them as evil, effectively. To separate them would be like holding that homosexuals may lack belief in evangelical Christian teaching about sinfulness of same-sex orientation, but not be protected when they speak out against a church institution, or that Reformed Protestants are not protected when they denounce the Church of Rome as the whore of Babylon, or the Pope as the Antichrist.
That's a pretty normal thing to write.
Yeah, so as I've tried to explain, this is a very normal judgment written by a very normal person in a normal way. So the thing about this is directly contrary to what was decided in Makareth, in my opinion. I genuinely believe that this is a concrete, incompatible error of law that is appealable. So Makareth, for people who don't know, is a case about a guy who held these same gender-critical beliefs and also believed, in addition to that, a couple of other things, such as that for trans people to live as their acquired gender was harmful to them, and that to use the pronouns of their preference was incompatible with that, and it reinforced this falsehood, all that kind of stuff. So core belief, sex is immutable, additional stuff on top of that, right? And the EAT found the Employment Tribunal's original assessment of those additional beliefs as lacking the necessary cogency and importance was acceptable, was correct, right? They held that, look, these beliefs start from this big overriding view that sex is immutable, and they get increasingly narrow so as to try and set up a situation where the actions of the claimant, Dr. Makareth, are justified on the basis that they are inherently tied to these very narrow expressions of this core belief. But the decision in Makareth was that no, these additional bits do not form part of this core belief. What they are is they are manifestations of it. So think of it as similar to, there's a case called ASME, which basically says that so you can be a Muslim woman with a belief in Islam, and that's your core belief, right? And then the additional manifestations of that are the way you choose to express that belief. So in the case of ASME, that was centered around the choice to wear a hijab, right? That being the expression of the core belief. So the core belief is the bit that's protected. Manifestations are also protected, but they're protected under indirect discrimination, not direct discrimination, right? So they are characteristics that people are more likely to hold because of this core belief, this protected characteristic, not part of the core belief itself. And that's a really important distinction, right? So I disagree with this paragraph here, and that I think denouncing the Church of Rome as the whore of Babylon is not a core part of that initial belief. It's very clear in Makareth that what that is, and what all narrow beliefs, the narrower categories are, is they are manifestations of that original core belief. And so here, I think that this is expressly wrong. I think that it's incompatible with Makareth, which is a higher decision, and I think that it can be appealed on that basis. Mir, you use your far greater expertise than me to tell me if I'm wrong.
I think it probably can be. I think it's unlikely to be. There's a conversation about how much hope we should have that this will be appealed, that I think we would need to have. Like and the other thing, of course, is that Makareth is going to be appealed anyway. So Makareth at the moment is unlikely to be given much weight, because everyone's very aware that that is almost certainly going to go to a higher court again. It's already a higher court than this. They're going to kind of level up and go to the next one. I think you're probably right, but I'm not sure that even if that's appealed, that's enough to change the result for Garden Court. So I think it's very unlikely that Garden Court are going to bother, is my honest assessment.
Why do you think they... So I would say that, like, I had the exact same conclusion. I thought Garden Court would not bother to appeal this decision, right? Because basically the money that they've lost to Alison Bailey, about 20 grand, is, in terms of Garden Court chambers, nothing. Mm-hmm. Pennies. As I have jokingly said, they probably spent more on dinners, right? This is very little to Garden Court as an organisation, and the amount of money and time and effort and bad publicity that would be generated by appealing it, and the legal costs associated with that, would be far, far greater. But what Garden Court chambers have put out in a statement by themselves is that they are looking to appeal.
Okay, I haven't seen that yet. I'm slightly behind the times. Okay, that's pretty cool.
So they have put a statement out on their website that they're looking to appeal. And I think this is because Garden Court Chambers is, first and foremost, a human rights chambers, and are renowned for that, and are renowned for being, a chambers that is progressive. Like, back when I thought I wasn't too disabled to become a barrister, they were the chambers that I had my hopes set on to work at, right? Like, because that they do the kind of law that I care about, and the kind of law that I think other people should care about. And so potentially on principle, they're looking to appeal this. And I think that this is wrong in law, and I really hope that they agree with me and that they bring an appeal on this basis. And I think it would be really interesting to see what happens if they do go ahead with the appeal.
As I say, I agree with you that I think this is wrong. I think this is incompatible with Makareth, and I think that the kind of the weird beliefs, the weird conspiracy theories. There's a conversation that, oh god, this gets very complicated. So my original understanding before these recent cases of Forstater and Makareth and this was, having read the law and read the old cases, was that a belief had to be a belief system. It was originally designed and written to include a religion, effectively, and it had to be something as important and serious as a religion, but not the belief in God wasn't necessary. So the classic example that was always used to explain it was humanism, where basically humanism isn't about the belief in God, but is a system of belief and opinions about how the world should work, which is all but equivalent to a religion. Does that make sense to everyone? Extending that to ethical veganism, which is ironically was done by the same lawyer as he then worked for Forstater, made a certain amount of sense in that context, because it was argued in that case as to be an entire system of belief and not just a set of one-off opinions. Whereas the Forstater decision, which is followed in this and in Makareth, is then that effectively any old belief, as long as it isn't against human rights, can then form the basis of a protected belief. And I think that's probably wrong. Like, fundamentally, on a legal level, I don't think that's right, but it needs to go to a court high enough to overrule the EAT in Forstater and in Makareth, and potentially this. And my hope for Makareth, and when that goes up to the Court of Appeal, is that the Court of Appeal will take one look at that and say, this is a misuse of the law, and what you've concentrated on is whether or not the belief breaks human rights law, and not actually look to whether or not it's a belief. This takes that a step further. This takes that already broken thing a step further. And I agree with you completely that this is clearly broken. Like, this is not this is not a belief. This is just a collection of conspiracy theories. But even if this is still a collection of conspiracy theories, yeah, I will be really interested to see what Garden Court do. As I say, I hadn't seen the statement. I've been a bit busy, and I haven't seen it. I hope they do this on principle, but it's not going to change the outcome for them, I don't think, because the thing that they were caught on is something where this doesn't help them.
I mean, it would change it, surely, right? If it's not a protected belief in the first place.
I mean, that would need to go beyond the EAT,
Yeah,
so
I
beyond
agree.
this to the EAT and then to the Court of Appeal. And I can't see them. They would have to fight it in the EAT, and they would have all the bad publicity of that, and then they would have to fight it in the Court of Appeal, whereas Macareth is already going to the Court of Appeal. So in terms of hope, and it is a hope, it's not an expectation, it's not something that I would want anyone to put any weight onto, but Macareth is the best hope at the moment for a court to look at this and go, what are you talking about? This is all nonsense.
Yeah.
And in general, like, the reason why that's my hope, and I'm trying to explain this to everyone, as well as talking to Jess. So I'm sorry, Jess, because I know you know all of this and I feel really bad for saying it. But that's exactly what happened in Bell and Tavistock. So in Bell and Tavistock, it took until a senior court got hold of it, and a senior court took one look at it and went, these aren't experts, this is nonsense, you made a decision that you weren't capable of making because you just got the law completely wrong, because you got tied up and caught up in a moral panic, effectively. And the Court of Appeal in Bell and Tavistock does a really good job of actually applying the law as it should always have been. And I'm a lawyer, and I kind of hope that eventually a senior enough judge will get hold of it and do the right thing. I'm also a lawyer who's read enough cases where that hasn't happened, that it's not a certainty. It's not. Often we end up with bad law for decades until someone gets around to fixing it, and it's something that makes me worried and sad. And I don't hold out a huge amount of hope that this is going to be properly appealed and taken apart in the way that I think it should be.
Yeah, I think this area of law as a whole has been rendered a complete mess. Even like completely abandoning like a perspective on trans rights and the importance of that stuff. Like, just in terms of legal sense, in terms of applying the Granger criteria, in terms of like generating a definition of this that is like makes sense under the original legislation, that is compatible with the way the European Convention on Human Rights is like structured. It's all just absolutely a mess, right? I think what needs to either happen is that a senior court needs to have a look at this and go and rationalize it, right? And put it into some sort of sense. Because I think what has happened is beliefs that were meant to be, you know, as you say, very like overarching. I mean, the definition is philosophical belief, right? Like, it's meant to be a very like overarching framework type belief, not just a strong enough belief in a thing, has been very much conflated with freedom of speech arguments about political beliefs. And what has happened is, in order to protect freedom of speech, and in order to protect freedom of expression, understandably, like under the human rights framework, it makes sense that courts would look and seek to promote and protect those things, because remember that benefits trans people as well, right? It benefits trans people to have robust protections of freedom of speech, so that employers can't sack us for saying trans rights on Twitter, right? And I think what's happened is that in an attempt to protect those things, an area of the law that was not designed for it, a legal test that was not designed for it, has been expanded beyond rationality to include these kind of ideas and arguments. And I think what we need to do is have a little think, and potentially even have legislation which, you know, provides a very separate and definite protection to political beliefs and political expression, and the rights of employees to use, you know, their time outside of work to express and promote their political opinions. I think, you know, we need protection for that. But the distinction that needs to be drawn between direct discrimination on the basis of belief, which is here, and those kind of protections, is that under human rights arguments and stuff like that, based on freedom of expression, freedom of speech stuff, you have a separate, you know, there's a second limb to it, which is that you're not allowed to interfere with people's right to do those things unless it's proportionate means of pursuing a legitimate aim, right? Unless you can explain that that is actually a really necessary thing for you to do to achieve an important goal. So, for example, to create a safe workspace, right? To ensure the safety of your other employees, to ensure the safety of your service users, to protect your reputation as a company, any of these types of things, right? If you and it should be interpreted narrowly, right? Because freedom of speech is important. But I think the distinction is that the second limb actually has to be gone through. Whereas for direct discrimination, there is no proportionality assessment that comes in. It's just, did you do it? Yes or no? And unless, apart from some narrow exceptions based on occupational requirements and stuff like that for religious schools and things like that, there is no justification the employer can make. And that's the problem, is that it's become a framework where any expression of a political belief is automatically 100% protected and the employer can do nothing about it. And that's completely inappropriate. That's not what we mean by protecting freedom of speech. It's become a nonsense area of law, and it needs rationalising and rewriting, I think.
Yep. I completely agree with absolutely all of that. My worry is always pragmatic. It's not that I think this is okay, because this is not okay. It's very much a case of, given that this is not okay, what's actually realistically going to happen about it? And I have no faith in this government to produce decent legislation on the topic. I have some hope that a court might do the decent thing, but it's hope and it's not an expectation.
And I will also make the note that, we have seen in more recent times, the court's increased unwillingness to stick its head above the parapet and defend legal rationality and human rights important issues out of fear of the government, the Judicial Power Project, stuff like that, coming for its authority. And, I think, entirely different context. We saw, the decision of the Supreme Court in Shamima Begum, which was described by many, including myself, to be, quite a cowardly decision on behalf of the Supreme Court. And I fear that, on an issue like this, where there are so many mainstream, quite powerful figures who are vehemently opposed to trans rights, that the Supreme Court, the Court of Appeal, might be drawn into the culture war fear. And I do worry pragmatically that this is an issue we're going to have to address politically rather than legally.
So there's actually a question that came through in the question form that touches on a lot of this. I think you've covered quite a lot of it. The question is, are you surprised at the findings of the judgment, given Part 2 of Article 9? I think that means from the Human Rights Act and the freedom of belief.
Yeah, so this is the problem with Part 2, is that...
I don't know what Part 2 is, though, so you're going to have to explain that to me.
Part 2 is that second limb I was talking about. Right?
Okay.
It's that proportionality assessment, that manifestation of a belief is, can be interfered with in pursuit of a legitimate aim. But the problem is that the Equality Act and the way it structures direct discrimination doesn't include that second limb. So,
and the other part of the question is there anything about the judgment that you think is correct?
Well, yeah, I think it was, obviously this is very much in my opinion, but I think the fact that a judge who has, in the language they've used in the judgment, very clearly demonstrated a bias towards a certain finding, the fact that even then they were unable to find against Stonewall, were unable to find in support of an indirect discrimination claim, shows just how weak those arguments were, no matter how much effort they wanted to put into reaching that conclusion, perhaps. My opinion being that the way that they framed the judgment quite clearly shows that was their ultimate goal. I think emphasizes that, the weakness of those arguments. And I think, that ultimately the judgment couldn't help but coming to the conclusion that the accusations against Stonewall were nonsense, and that the claim based on all lesbians being more likely to support gender critical beliefs and women being more likely to support gender critical beliefs were absolute nonsense, and they just couldn't be substantiated. And I think, the judgment can't help but showing that.
That's my personal favourite bit. Is there are a couple. That is one of them. The statement that gender critical beliefs are mostly held by men, I think, is just wonderful. And it goes on to, it says that in lots and lots of words, but primarily the most transphobes are men is just objectively true, and even this judge couldn't decide otherwise. The other thing that I think it gets right, although I don't know the way in which it says it, because of course it's this judgment, so it says it in the most awful way possible, is that it does correctly point out 2 points, which is the first of which is that the way this case was presented was obsessed with trans women in a really quite bizarre way, and the moral panic about trans women in this case is just clearly nonsense. I don't like the way it says that directly. The quote I put in my thread, but the quote is weird. But the fact that it acknowledges that is important, because that's something that we are going to need to hold on to. And the second one is that remember that a belief in gender is protected to an equal and opposite extent as to the lack of belief in gender, as Makareth described it, or gender critical as Forstetter to describes it. And where that's really important is it's important in keeping people safe. And much as I quite enjoy sitting and chatting with Jess and my other lawyer friends and saying kind of, what about this and how does this fit together? There's a fundamental part of everything that I do which is about keeping people safe. I don't want anyone to take any risks with their livelihood, with themselves. I want everyone to be safe, because that's fundamentally important. Which one of the biggest reasons to get involved in any of this is to keep as many people as safe as humanly possibly can. And to do that, sometimes you need to stand up and be counted, because there's a bunch of not very nice people who are currently trying very hard to take human rights away. That's the point at which you have to fight to keep people safe. It's not a pacifist, is that the way of saying that? Opinion. It's an active opinion, but it's really important that that's in this judgment, because it means that anyone saying I'm gender critical and therefore trans people can't do X, Y, or Z, you can literally say, Bailey says people who believe in this are also protected, and therefore anything you do which has the effect of discriminating against those people, who will probably in general be women and will probably be more likely to be protected by the Section 7 protected characteristics. You've immediately got 2 grounds there in order to hammer it home. That gives you a huge amount of protection from nonsense from gender criticals at work. And protection from nonsense from gender criticals at work is a serious concern. It's kind of, but when I sit and talk about this with trans lawyer friends, it's the first thing that we think about, is how do we keep people safe from gender critical nonsense at work. If I'm honest, that's the biggest worry. So there's 2 things in this that are really helpful for that, and I think they're right.
I'm not sure how many. Oh, I'm just trying.
Yeah, I think that this is the last slide potentially.
Think so. It is indeed.
Yeah. So I think, very much building on what Mia just said, that the ultimate aim should be trans safety, right? It should be protecting trans people at work. And so looking at all these decisions that have just come out, what can we do? What can we talk about as a community to take steps which do protect trans people at work? I think what really shines through Makareth, Forstater, and indeed this decision is that it's really, really important that employers follow due process and they have policies in place that they can then rely upon to explain their decisions, rather than taking a very reactive approach to stuff that's already gone wrong, right? So what should have happened with Alison Bailey is that there should have been a social media policy in place about how employees use their social media accounts, which could, for example, and it applies equally to everybody. So you could have a social media policy that was very strict, and you could say on an account that is associated with us as an organisation, you're not allowed to tweet about controversial political issues. You're not allowed to tweet about these kind of things. You're only allowed to, do things that won't affect our reputation as a company. Or you could have a more flexible policy where you could say something along the lines of like, these are the values of Garden Court Chambers. You're not allowed to tweet about things that are in conflict with these values. So one of those values could be things like, we believe that trans people deserve dignity and respect and blah, 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 and all those kind of things you see in social media policies. We've seen quite a lot of good social media policies being shared by unions, actually. I think Unison put out one recently, which is quite good. And employees can look at these and use these policies to guide their decisions. So you have that social media policy. You can then have people who put in a formal complaint about, someone's actions conflicting with that policy. And then you have a proper investigation internally. Don't announce your investigations on Twitter, mainly because it's not necessary. You have a proper formal procedure you follow, you do it step by step, you follow all the rules, and then you come to the conclusion, right? And you take the action that is, specified by the policy, specified by the procedure. And if you do that, you follow all these steps, you act in line with it, and you make sure that the policy you use in the first place isn't one that's discriminatory, then the conclusion you reach should be entirely lawful, right? You should be protected from these sorts of claims. And you should be able to create an environment that makes your colleagues safe, that makes your employees safe, that makes your service users safe, right? And that's what we should be organising around. That's what we should be talking about with our employers. If you work for someone and you don't have a social media policy, why not think about it, right? If you work for someone and you don't have a proper complaints procedure in place, why not think about it? Make sure that you talk to, especially if you work for a big company, which, both CGD and Garda Court were, you should be having very formal, very proper procedures in place, and they should be being followed. It's not appropriate to be making decisions on an ad hoc basis, because what happens is you open yourself up to allegations about the real reasons you come to conclusions, right? Whereas if you have a policy in place, you have a procedure and everything's documented, and the way that you do it is documented, then no one can make those allegations, because you have the evidence that explains exactly which step, why you made certain decisions, how you came to them, what procedures were followed. And then, if someone tries to sue you, you can go, actually, no, look, here's exactly how it happened. You can't make the allegation that Stonewall was secretly manipulating us and that we were making it entirely off the basis of what we thought your tweets said rather than actually reading them, or because we wanted to calm down a Twitter storm. Act professionally.
So there's a question that came up relating to this saying, and I'll just read it out. I'm currently working in equality and diversity in the NHS, and I'm hopefully helping to make progress and work against bias in the system. I want to do more, though, and love the work that everyone here is doing. For someone who isn't trained in law, what are some of the most impactful things a person could be doing? In my work, I can't call out such explicit bias in BBC, the courts, or healthcare, which can be frustrating.
Yeah, so look at your policies, look at your internal systems, and see, is there a way that these are currently is the way that these are currently working effective? Do they adequately protect trans people? And, especially for an organisation as large as the NHS, seeking legal advice on these kind of policies and issues is always useful. Get a solicitor to look over it for you. May, you know far more about this than me. So.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm just thinking about what I'm allowed to say. I have a day job. Yeah. If you're working for the NHS, then realistically, there are actually several different practical things that you can do. And Jess is completely right. Absolutely. Check the policies that are already in place. This is why I hesitated, because I was about to demonstrate the fact that I know what policies are already in place. but actually that's fine because I know through a way that is legitimate and fine. So the NHS already has fairly decent general policies in place. Most public sector employers do. Not all public sector employers do. And it is worth going and double checking and having a look. But in general, you will find the public sector are better at looking at what unions are doing and are generally stronger on EDI in general, or DEI, depending on which way round you put it, and I never remember which. I'm really sorry. So from
I
that
think
point,
it goes both ways.
It goes both. Yeah, it depends.
it's one of those things where I really worry that that people do it in different orders for a reason, and I can never remember which one is the better one. So I say both, and just hope. I think it's really important. I have too many things in my head. So from that point of view, if you're working for the public sector, then absolutely you're already onto a winner because you've already got most of those policies in place to back you up. It's then a case of making sure that those policies are actioned and used in a positive and helpful way. And part of the way you do that is just on an everyday level, look out for your colleagues and your co-workers and your friends. Like that's not something you need to be legally trained to do. That's not something you need to have a highfalutin job to do. That just literally, it's so simple and it's so important, and it comes up so often where don't just leave it to the person who is being affected to complain or to put in a grievance or to use the policies. Actually go out there and go, well, I've seen this thing happen. This is not okay. I'm going to back up the person who's having this problem. I'm going to talk to them about how they want me to deal with it. But I'm also going to tell them that I'm happy to help write things. I'm happy to support them. I'm happy to evidence them. I'm happy to back up what they're saying. It's actually like, if you work in EDI already, brilliant. Like, get in there and make sure the policies are usable and used and active and all of that good stuff. Please do. But actually, every single person who's got a job is there and can make a difference. And the example of this, which I was so I'm not sure embarrassed is the right word. I was embarrassed, but someone came to me when they were sexually assaulted by a colleague, and they came to me afterwards and they talked to me about it, and they said, I came to talk to you because you noticed them being a dick, her words. I noticed you noticed them being a dick and you called them out on it, and you were the only person to do it. And I called them out on it because they were being a dick, and I'm very lucky. I'm incredibly privileged. I was in a position where I could do that, and I did. But I did that just because I'm a human. I didn't do that because I'm a lawyer or because I'm a genius or any of the kind of... I just did that because it was the human reaction in the moment. If someone was being a dick to my friend, and like, why would you do that? Like, go away, don't do that. And then it turned out that was... I was really weirdly, I was one of the only people who had seen the behaviour in the leading up to things going really horrifically badly wrong. And I was therefore one of the few people that she felt she could trust. And it's just such a... like... I talk a lot about how I'm a very privileged person and I'm very, very lucky in lots and lots of ways, but it doesn't take a lot sometimes to make a really big difference. Every single person has the power to make a difference. You just have to be a decent human being and to use the tools that you've got. And if you've got the power to make the tools that everyone else has got better, please do that. It's really important. If you are a lawyer, if you are in EDI, if you are in HR, you can absolutely make a difference. Do reach out, talk to lawyers. If I had more time, I would write you a toolkit. I don't. But also, just anyone can make a difference. And sometimes it's the tiniest things that you don't even realize that make the difference. So just, that.
Another really important thing is to join a union and to encourage your colleagues to do so. Unions are very important. Unions will provide legal advice. Union reps will sit with you in meetings when you make complaints about people, right? Like, it's important to join a union if you can. I'd really highly recommend that you look at which union is relevant to which sector you're in and you join one. And if you have time, if you have energy, do work within your union to help promote these kind of inclusive policies, to support your fellow workers in their struggles against companies that might have bad policies, that might implement their policies in bad ways. Unions are important, and it's a way of supporting each other in a more formal way, rather than relying on the hope that your colleagues are going to be the ones that speak out for you if something goes wrong. It's important to have a union because they'll have your back.
Mm-hmm.
Agreed. We are we're 90 minutes through. Now, we're in no rush whatsoever, just as long as other folks here are grand. I'm just wondering, for Twitch chat, this is going to be the first time a lot of folks in Twitch chat, in most environments in general, will be coming into contact with a lot of this stuff. If folks have any questions or are wondering anything, now is a good time to be putting those in. You can use the Google form that's been linked before, or stick them directly into chat if you can't have access to that, and we'll try to pick out a few if that works. Mallory, I'm not sure what we have already in the Google form.
Yeah, we've got quite a few. I've read out a couple of them because they were specifically relevant to what was being talked about already. But I think, like, just as a quick palate cleanser, and I think this one came in before the Twitch stream. But who would win in a fight? Brock Lesnar versus Brock Lesnar, but she's transitioned now. Which is clearly Brock Lesnar, but she's transitioned now because trans women are superpowered. Yeah. So one person asked, you talked about how certain cases have led to gender critical beliefs being protected in the workplace. How can trans rights and trans people be protected from workplace discrimination legally, assuming there's some legal protections in place, whilst transphobia is also protected?
So I think the important thing to bear in mind is that the right to discriminate against people at work is not protected. Gender critical views are not protected to that extent, and the right to use your gender critical views in a workplace in a way that is harmful to your service users or your colleagues is explicitly not protected. That's what Macareth decided, right? Is that, to explain the facts of Macareth, David Macareth was a DWP assessor, right? He was a doctor who did assessments for the DWP, medical assessments. When he started, they went through their inclusivity training and whatever. And in his inclusivity training, when they were talking about trans service users and the fact that the DWP's policy is to use the preferred names and pronouns of anyone who comes through their service, no matter what they are, right? Like, it doesn't matter if you're trans, you use the name, you use the pronoun that's given on the form, doesn't matter, right? And David Macareth says, I'm a Christian, I can't do that, I think that's wrong, right? He says, based on his beliefs from Genesis and whatever, he would be unable to use pronouns that he didn't believe were the correct ones for a person, right? And that would conflict with his beliefs. And so the DWP were like, well, sorry, that's our policy. That's what we need you to do. We deal with some really vulnerable people who come in who might be more likely to have mental health issues than other people. We can't just have you sat in an assessment misgendering them. It's not something we're going to accept. And it basically resulted in David Macareth resigning. He alleges he was kind of pushed out. DWP were just like, well, he refused them and he just kind of left. Either way, the court, the tribunal decided, no, it's entirely legitimate for an organisation to have a policy about the way that pronouns are used, particularly in this context. It was an entirely proportionate thing for them to do. And no, David Macareth can't claim that because of his beliefs he's allowed to go around using whatever pronouns he wants. And in Forstater, in the decision where they held that gender critical beliefs were protected, they were very explicit that protection does not give you the right to harass trans people, doesn't give you the right to misgender people or your colleagues on a whim. That can amount to harassment under the Equality Act, something else that is protected. So whilst your gender critical right to tweet about trans people in your own time might be something that is protected, doesn't give you the right to bring your anti-trans views into the workplace, to harass other people, doesn't give you the right to work in a way that is incompatible with your employer's policies. Trans people are and continue to be protected in the workplace. If you're a trans person who is working with someone who's gender critical, they repeatedly misgender you, you can bring a complaint about that. You are protected under the Equality Act from that harassment. In fact, your employer is under a legal duty to ensure you are protected.
Yep.
And your employer will be liable in law and in costs for not protecting you.
Exactly.
Which is really important, because that's the lever that you need in order to get your employer to definitely do something about it. Yeah. And it's why in terms of the HR side of things, all of these gender critical cases have so far had a very limited impact on the advice in most HR circumstances, because they are wise enough to realize that this is just one more belief to add to a list of beliefs. It's not something that changes any of the protections that there have been for trans people. So it's really interesting to see how limited the HR community's response to this has been. I've not been heartened, but I'm pleased that it's so small. All of the Twitter nonsense, all of the press coverage, it's had very, very limited impact in HR policies, and that's a really, really good sign.
And I think there's a bigger question around cases like this, which reflect on the modern age we now have with employment, right? And outside of the gender critical context, although those are the cases that have shone a light on this, like, to what extent is your employer entitled to, and we have to ask ourselves as a society to what extent we're happy with your employer being entitled to act on behaviour you engage with completely outside of work. There's a bigger question about the separation between the workplace and between people's personal lives. Back in the day, if you went to the market and spoke to some people about whatever beliefs you had, it's unlikely your employer would ever find out, or that anyone would ever be able to evidence it at the very least. Whereas now we exist in an age of social media where everything we say is permanent, undeleted in the archives of the internet forever. Whilst I don't support the right of people to say very horrible things about trans people, there's a question to what extent that is the business of employers. Mm-hmm. Of course it is, to the extent that employers are interested in protecting their reputations and making sure that their service users feel like they're safe when they use their services, and that people's colleagues feel safe. But there is a question to what extent we're happy with a society in which employers are entirely allowed to control what we do outside of work. And I think that that is an important question. And I think it's why the big focus on safety here should be about what is and isn't allowed at work, what isn't allowed when engaging with people and creating an environment that's toxic for them.
That is one other thing I would say. There's a common thread in this and a couple of the other cases where they're talking about the currency of debate. And one of the excuses that has been given for these judgments is the toxicity, or the perceived toxicity of debates. That effectively transphobes are being told that the more toxic they make the debate, the more that gives them protection. And I think that's an incredibly dangerous thread of decisions in these cases. And when Jess and I were talking earlier about kind of a superior court taking a look at this and going, well, this is just nonsense, that's another element that is ripe for a senior court to look at and say, actually, just because something is contentious doesn't mean that you can behave worse. Because I think it actually is a really dangerous idea. It's a really poorly thought through idea, and that's why it's dangerous. It's not dangerous in any other way. So it's a really ill-conceived is probably the better way of describing it, but it's a really bad idea. And it's a really bad explanation and justification for all of this. And that's something that I'm looking out for in all of these cases, is to see where that thread of judicial thought is going. At the moment, it's very much a case of, oh, look, I found a picture of somebody saying something bad on Twitter once in 2017 that may or may not be photoshopped and probably isn't real, but this definitely justifies someone saying all of this nonsense in a work environment. And I think that's nonsense. I genuinely think that is an astonishingly ill-conceived idea. But that's another thing to look out for as we go on with this, is kind of when that gets knocked on the head, and when that because that will come to an end. That's exactly the kind of thing judges are going to come to and say, actually, this is not the way that we want society to run, and this is not freedom of speech. This is just people being objectionable for ill-defined and unjustifiable reasons. And it's okay in an employment context to say that people can't do that. And Jess's question is a good one. Like, to what extent is your employer allowed to tell you what you can and can't do on Twitter? Well, quite obviously, you can't see my face. I'm not on video, and there's a reason for that. And that it's because I can't do this in my own name, because that's linked to my employment. And that is a direct consequence of that decision. And if there's then a legal decision that says, well, you can't be, your employment can't be linked to this, well, I'll stop being anonymous, because I'm not ashamed of anything that I'm saying. It's very much a case of I won't have a job if I do this in my own name as it stands with the current rules and the current Law Society guidance. So there is a future in which that's protected in a different way. I don't think the way the gender critical people are going about it is the way to achieve that. I think the gender critical people are just looking for a way to be transphobic and get away with it.
Yeah, the reality is, and for those of us who say these kind of things, is the moment I get a job working for a law firm or something like that, my Twitter account is going to disappear. Right, and I'll be like, bye everyone, and suddenly the next day there'll be an account that develops with incredibly similar tweets that has the name of my cat and a picture of a cat on it, right? And because the reality is that there are consequences for people who use their name and their face and their public position to advocate for certain things. Like, obviously, like at the moment I'm freelance, I work with TSN. I am not bound to anybody, and so I'm able to come on here and talk about these things and not worry that it's going to have a negative impact on my employment. But it is concerning as a society. I think that is something that I would be worried about. And I think generally speaking, UK employment law is very, very much in favour of the employer. Right? Like, it is massively structured in favour of the employer, and that's a bad thing. To some extent, I have sympathy with people like Mayor Forstater and Alison Bailey, because I do think to some extent it's wrong for employers to be asked to take a position on people's private lives. But I do think that, there becomes a point where it does influence work. And when Mayor Forstater is bringing in leaflets into work, that's, to me, when that kind of line begins to be crossed. And you're using your position as your job and the reputation that comes with it in order to amplify your views. In order to, it makes sense that there is a conflict at that point.
The example, Jess, with this one is that Alison Bailey had Garden Court in her Twitter bio, and you said that, like, you had thought of Garden Court chambers as the kind of place that you would want to practice. Like, the moment that you are using your employer's name and your position in order to bolster your opinions on whatever they might be, personally, that's the point for me when that line gets crossed. Like, it's not okay for me to bring my employer into things I think without my employer having the chance to say so. And that's, so my employer is not in my Twitter bio. I don't do any of this in my own name or in a way that can be linked back to my employer, because that, to me, that makes that separation really clear. But there's nothing wrong with having an account, in theory at least, there's nothing wrong with having an account in your own name. As long as your name isn't directly linkable to your employer, because there's a website where you could be found and it's 3 clicks away, which is the slight problem with being a solicitor, because it is 3 clicks away. And
in the world of LinkedIn, it's a problem, right? If someone Googles my name, first thing that comes up is the Twitter account. Second thing that comes up is my LinkedIn profile. So it becomes very clear, like, to which organisations I'm linked. And it's very difficult.
And that's the thing. Like, it's not okay to use your employer's reputation to
To
further your
launder
own.
your views, right?
Yeah, which is exactly what I would argue Bailey was doing here, and I think is exactly what the core reason why I think it's reasonable for Garden Court to have acted in some way. I'm not sure I agree with what they did, but that's another conversation for another day. But the reason I think it's reasonable for Garden Court to have acted at all is that she was directly causing them reputational harm, because what she was advocating went against the expressed views and using that ethos word again from the beginning of the stream, but it goes against the ethos of the chambers. And ethos is a bit of a dirty word, because I went to a religious school and absolutely does have a special context in that in that environment. But it is also something that matters. It's okay to have to decide as an organisation what kind of organisation you're going to be, and for everyone to have shared values in that organisation, as long as those shared values don't discriminate against people with protected characteristics. And being inclusive doesn't do that. And it's okay to be expressly inclusive and say we're an inclusive organisation that seeks to include everyone. And I think that should be okay. So from that point of view, it's weird. It's a difficult area of law, because it's arguing difficult things, and the line between when is it okay to do and when is it not is the difficult one. And I think some of the easier cases to make decisions about what's okay or not are people being racist about football, because it's very clear if you've got the name of your estate, you're an estate agent, you've got the name of your estate agency in your Twitter bio as you're being racist about a footballer, that brings your workplace into disrepute. At that point, it's okay for your work to say, we're not okay with you doing this. And that's why Bailey's agreement then rescinded, then complicated, to take Garden Court Chambers out of her bio, and to at least then not be trading on the Garden Court name, is, I think, it's important in some way to understand kind of what you can and can't do. Like, you can't use the fact of where you work to make unfounded allegations about a charity, which is what Bailey was doing.
I think, like, for me, the most interesting context for all of this is in the Green Party case that, we're seeing at the moment. Like, what happens when not just damaging the reputation of your employer, but, you're contravening the exact purpose of your employer, right, in your beliefs and your views and the way you express yourself. With a political party, if, I'm elected to stand on a manifesto and to, propose those views, and there are very explicit, like, party stances on specific issues, and then I use my Twitter account to talk completely contrary to those beliefs, I completely undermine the political arguments my party's making, right? Like, to me, that's one of the most interesting things, because of course that's an issue for your employer. You're secretly working against them, effectively, not even secretly, publicly working against the very things they're trying to achieve.
That case is going to be astonishing. I'm not looking forward to it because it's going to be dreadful, but I'm intrigued by it, because one of the things about that is that the Green Party rules effectively said you can have your own opinions about everything, and we're really keen on freedom of speech, but you must make it clear that the party has voted on and decided on opinions, and you must state the party's opinions as well as your own. And the reason given at the moment was that rule wasn't being followed. So even in a circumstance where someone was allowed to have their own opinions and they were incredibly hot on human rights and protecting human rights, they had a really, really limited kind of, but you must say what we have decided democratically as a party, because we're a democratic party and we vote on all our policies. And it was that failure of the second limb is what finally led to the sanctions within the party. And that to me screams something that is justifiable.
Also, I think, you can very, very clearly make an argument under the occupation requirement exception, right? Mm-hmm. So for people who don't know that, basically there is an exception to the direct discrimination thing I was talking about earlier, which says that if it's an occupational requirement, it's entirely necessary for your job that you hold certain characteristics, then, which includes belief, then, yeah. So, for example, the Catholic Church is allowed to discriminate in who it hires as priests, right? Because in their theology, only men can be priests. So they're allowed to discriminate on the basis of sex for that reason, because to them, part of their theology, it's an occupational requirement of being a priest that you be a guy. Fine. right? And the same applies surely to a political party. It's an occupational requirement of representing a political party that you at least pretend to believe in the same political beliefs.
The one takeaway from that before we stop or move on is that one of the biggest risks to gender critical, the furtherance of gender criticalism, if that's a thing, is its overreach. So the problem with running something in the way that gender critical is run, which is in every stage people are always trying to radicalize the next person. This is run more in the shape of a cult, whether or not it's a cult. That's a question for somebody a lot cleverer than I am. But it's run in the shape of a cult, so it's about radicalizing. That means there's a drift towards the more radical. And that means that each of the cases that's been brought has taken us further and further away from anything that could be described as reasonable, even with inverted commas around it.
That is the pattern for sure.
Yeah, and that's a risk to them. That because what they'll do is, as they push each of these cases further and further and further away, they're going to lose more and more and more of them, and they're going to damage their own ability to be the nasty little whatsits that they are. So overreach is another avenue of this. I do wonder if that Green case is going to be the one that overreaches it. I'm not sure if Makareth is going to be that either. It's something to look out for as well when you see the ever wilder claims that are being made. Remember that that's a very, very double-edged sword, and they're not very good at being temperate and thinking through what they're doing as a movement rather than as on an individual basis.
On the culty thing, that's certainly the pattern of, I mean, the sort of movement or whatever as a whole. And I guess coming back to the idea that some of these cases are less perhaps strategic, like the crowdfunding is less strategic litigation, but money and more advertising money or more PR money. It certainly seems that a lot of these groups do have some significant success in recruitment and the initial stages of radicalization through the exposure that they can achieve through media discussion of these sorts of cases. So even if it is still more even if it's stupid legally, as they may be sometimes, they're very successful in the sort of cult-like approach to recruitment, and this seems to be the area that they put the most money and time into. So it makes perfect sense. It makes perfect sense that their cases get less and less, grounded in reality as they go on.
Yeah, legitimate would be the obvious word there, I think.
It's very similar to how Christian Concern and groups like that, like groups like Spock and Christian Concern and various other kinds of those religious groups have previously gone, where they'll take a case and the case will be like abortion should be illegal, and the law will be like, but abortion's illegal. But they'll take the case anyway because they want to have like a story in the newspaper. Or, I mean, Makareth is one of those cases. Makareth is one of those cases where he wanted to just flagrantly just ignore the equality at work and treat trans people in a discriminatory way.
I think it's also important to note when we're talking about crowdfunding, the way that Crowd Justice as a platform operates, which is like the legal crowdfunding platform that they all tend to use, although some of them operate their own little spin-offs or use GoFundMe and stuff like that. Crowd Justice is the main platform. And basically what happens if a case receives more money than it ends up spending, right, on Crowd Justice, is that the money from that case is then diverted to other cases that the owner of the case deems similar, right? So you can very easily end up with people donating to a very explicitly radical feminist case, right? Of like a single-sex women's liberation type spaces case. And if that case gets way more money than it needs, then that excess money can be very quickly diverted and sent to organisations like Christian Concern, who are running similar cases, but for entirely different bases. And in fact, if the organisation who owns a case is a charity, which Christian Concern is, or a non-profit, not necessarily a charity. So because Christian Concern is a non-profit, any excess money it gets, it can keep. So you can end up with a path where money donated by a radical feminist to a radical feminist case goes to Christian Concern's case that tries to achieve the same things but for far-right regressive reasons, and then ends up in the pockets of Christian Concern to be spent on their anti-abortion campaigning.
Very cool.
I should be clear that we haven't seen any clear evidence that is happening, but
Yes.
it's interesting.
I've been doing some research recently, reading through the crowd justice terms and conditions, and whilst I'm not aware of that happening in practice, theoretically, that is where the money can end up. There is nothing to stop that from happening. It's very interesting.
I imagine that's going to be difficult information to get, but that would be
It's
be a
almost
fun
impossible
one.
information
Yeah,
to get. I have no idea how that
that'd be a
information would
fun
be
one.
acquired legitimately, unless someone literally leaked it and then not legitimate. So, yeah, I have no idea. All I know is that the way that the policy is structured, the way that the terms and conditions are structured, enable that to happen.
Yeah, the whole money side of this is a rabbit hole that you could jump down for 48 hours at a time without taking a break. And that's even just the national funding side of it, not the international, which is a whole other thing when you get across the Atlantic.
The relationship between money in America and money here and the cases is just wild.
Yeah, it's. I do not miss researching that. We are 2 hours in, and want to make sure that we're not blowing people's heads up too much.
Yep.
Is there anything, or at least we take a break so that people can get a walk around or whatever? I got to sneak out to go for a pee, but others haven't. Is there anything that for the average person watching this on YouTube or person in Twitch chat right now or average person, is there anything that you would recommend keeping an eye on over the next little while, or just having to think about when you see these people doing this sort of organizing in the near future? Is there anything that, if one thing you should keep in the back of your mind, what would that be?
I mean, the one thing I would always encourage people to keep in the back of their mind is policies, safety, protecting each other at work. Because the reality is that, most people have absolutely no control over the legal system. And in reality, we have no democratic control over the parliamentary political system. So most of the organising we can do to protect each other is not through these big gestures. It's through little organising, mutual aid, getting involved with the union, protecting each other. That's, to me, the outcome of all of this. Keep an eye on it, know what kind of things you need to be aware of, know what harms are coming your way, but the best thing you can do to resist them is organise with each other.
Mm-hmm.
Mia or Mallory, do you have any different thoughts on that, or any additions?
I completely agree. I think the grand scale stuff is great. I love it. It's brilliant, but it's also out of reach. The amount of money and resource needed to fight this on an even footing, if you don't have massive funding from the evangelical far right in America, is impossible. So you have to do. I don't like relying on the DWP to appeal Mekareth properly, but ultimately, unfortunately, that's the position we're in. We have to kind of use the institutional power that is granted by the fact that the law says you can't discriminate against trans people lawfully, except in very, very minor exceptions, which are really, really narrowly defined. and they're narrowly defined by statute, they're narrowly defined by statutory guidance, and the fact that there's anything else floating around is invalid. So it's what Jess said. It's learn about the policies, make sure the policies in place, learn about what rights you have, and look out for each other, and be a good person. That's the simplest, most. It's almost not legal advice. It's so simple, but it's really important. And if you see something happen, like the biggest thing that will stop a gender critical person is somebody seeing them do something discriminatory at work, reporting it properly, an employer following the policy, and then if the gender critical person makes the mistake of bringing the legal case against an employer who's followed a policy properly, that can pop the entire bubble. Like, let the gender critical movement spend vast amounts of money on lawyers. Someone's got to pay lawyers. We all need jobs eventually. I'd rather that they didn't, but if they're going to waste money on this, I'd rather that they wasted money on laws where they're effectively fighting against massive, like the fundamentals of the Equality Act, for example, come from human rights law via EU law. If we change the Equality Act in any significant way, we're in breach of various very major things that we've agreed with the EU in terms of the Northern Ireland peace process. It's not stuff I want mucked around with, but it's stuff that anyone with any sense is not going to muck around with, and we have to eventually hope we'll end up with a government with some sense, because we certainly haven't got one at the moment. Human rights law is even bigger. Human rights law is Council of Europe, and removing ourselves from that is directly kind of word for word in contravention of the Good Friday Agreement. So the core of the law that gender critical people would like to change is not going to change. Like, they're not going to change Goodwin versus the UK. Goodwin versus the UK says that changing your legal gender is a human right, and you have a human right to privacy, and part of that is access to spaces, is access to changing your identity of documents, is a right to change your legal name. In addition to that, that's one of the things from Goodwin. That's the only way of changing that, is to literally make the UK a pariah state. And while I know that GCs would like that, it's not going to happen unless we end up with a genuinely fascist government, in which case we should all be helping each other run away rather than anything else. But short of that, it's as much about keeping each other safe, and as safe as we possibly can. So the stuff to look out for is a situation in which you can help make the difference, and no one wants to be a test case, but it's the way of helping each other keep each other safe, because that will give them the opportunity to destroy themselves. And over time, I mean, Mallow is the expert on this, I'm not, but hate movements destroy themselves because they're built on hate, and it's core to their very being. They will eventually start ripping each other apart. The stuff that I'm not going to talk about, where GCs are already starting to rip themselves apart.
There's
anyone who's interested in the very interesting inside of the GCs is that, they already try and accuse each other of being secret trans people. If anyone wants to get an insight into how off the wall stuff
so
can
good.
get,
It's so good.
Without going anywhere near any details, they leak against each other constantly, all the time. It's insane to me. I just genuinely don't understand. I don't get it. It doesn't make any sense in any way. They hate each other. They hate each other more than they hate trans people sometimes.
Yeah. The only way to resist a movement which is built on hate is to build our own movement built on care, radical care for each other, and we should continue to do that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm gonna say not too much because we're running out of time rapidly, but separate from what everyone else said, I would say the big thing they want is to build momentum and panic, and the best thing you can do, you can tell from the way they all had headlines ready to go saying, Alison Bailey has won against Stonewall, when there's no way that they could have read a 117-page thing that fast. But they were determined to say that anyway. My big thing is just don't buy the hype, don't go along with the momentum that they're trying to create, because they want people to believe they're winning. A lot of it's just about PR, and it's not really about anything else. There's no substance to it.
Just look at the stuff they've been saying about Tavistock, right? They've been like, oh yeah, it's not safe for children. We finally brought down this evil institution. What's the reality? They're
Trans people have been saying
it.
Tavistock's not good for
Yeah,
children.
we've
for
been
ages.
saying it's terrible. And so what they're doing, they're making a better system, arguably. That's what they're trying to do, arguably. Is that they're making an expansive, local, regionalised system instead, as opposed to the very centralised, limited resource system. You know, it's not like this organisation has been destroyed and all trans healthcare for youth is gone. No, that's not what's happened. If anything, it's getting expanded. It's getting bigger. Don't buy the hype. Stay frosty.
Yeah. I just wanted to say as well, thank you to Ellen for having us on here. It's been really...
yeah, thank you so much. It's great.
Pleasure. It's not something that just for folks, because I noticed some new Twitch accounts in chat as well, and for yourselves, if I'm not sure how familiar with Twitch you are, you don't see much of this sort of stuff on Twitch. There is an increasing, actually, it's a strange world where some of the biggest streams on this whole platform are objectively like pro-union, like ostensibly left, very like trans-positive. It's called Just Chatting on Twitch, but news and discussion stuff. It's one of the biggest things in this whole platform now. And then debate nonsense, which we won't go near, certainly at the moment, but this is fairly unusual, so it's interesting to see how it goes, and seems to have a good response so far. For folks to find you, this was these still the best place? I'm guessing since you sent the slides earlier today, they're still the best places to find you. Is there anything that any of you are doing in the near future that people should look out for?
I should have some more articles coming out, both about this decision, more specifically focusing on the like Stonewall side of it and the cope that has come and the fallout of that. And I'm also going to have another article coming out about the attempt to use human rights more generally to achieve regressive goals and what we should be doing about that.
Sounds good. And they can people can get that at your Twitter at DisabledJess.
Always tweeting absolute nonsense at Disabled Jess. So yeah.
Yeah, chat won't like people on Twitter, but go ahead. Mallory or Mir, anything that people should look forward to?
I'm going to sit down over the weekend and finish going through the judgment, just so that there's a record of it and people can properly understand just how wild it is. I've been trying so hard not to swear. It might crack.
Swear away.
Not on here, it's just in general on that.
Oh.
The judgment is wild. It is absolutely fucking wild, and it shouldn't exist. Like, it's just wrong. So I am going to sit and explain to everyone why, so that everyone else can understand just how wrong it is. But that's quite a job, so I'll sit down and do that probably tomorrow afternoon if I get a minute. Otherwise, no, it's always Witterings. If anyone needs anything in particular, just to ask. If someone is worried about something or wants something looked at or explained to them, I'm more than happy to do it if I've got time. But it's generally more a case of trying to just tell people not to panic, because this isn't a bad judgment. This is really good. Stonewall come out of this, and Stonewall will... Okay, one final thing to talk about before we go is costs. So Stonewall will have... Nothing I'm saying here is in insider information. This is just logic and how the law works. But Stonewall will have made provision for costs. Stonewall will have been liable for somewhere in the region of 70% of Bailey's costs if she lost. They would argue it down, but somewhere in that region. So if you think that Bailey's costs were £500,000, 70% of that, you're looking at somewhere in the region of £250,000 that Stonewall have had to put aside to deal with this case. And they come away from this with not only not paying her costs, but they also will recover a big proportion of their own costs. So Stonewall have got a load more money that they can spend on that stuff that's actually good, and that's Brilliant.
Well, I guess that £500,000 might go somewhere useful.
Seriously, a good chunk of it is going to go paying Stonewall's legal bills.
What a terrible, terrible situation all around.
More money for Stonewall to spend on their diversity scheme.
Yeah.
Yeah.
God.
Yeah, in terms of what I'm doing a bunch of research that will hopefully turn into articles. I am mostly exposing conversion therapists, but I'm also doing some research into the safety concerns around DIY and bathtub hormone replacement therapies that some people are taking. And I'm looking into the hate networks. Well, I've been for quite a while, but I haven't published anything yet. I've been looking into the hate networks that Ellen was looking at last night around Drag Queen Story Hour. As a like tantalizing little tidbit about that. I don't know if chat knows anything about someone called Debbie Hayton. But there's a relatively well-known anti-trans woman called Debbie Hayton who's been spotted yesterday at one of these Drag Queen Story Hour protests, standing there.
Oh, that is music to my ears. Thank you.
I thought she wasn't a trans woman anymore. I thought she described herself as an AGP male.
Yeah, she's an autogynephilic man, which it's like fair play to her for like really going with the bit there. But yeah, she was filmed next to Mad Mick of Mad Mick's Conspiracies, and yeah, like there's just
That's so good.
there's so much more to know here, and she's been all right. So I'm just gonna side tangent off here. I know everyone needs a like comfort break.
It's fine.
Anyway, so she's been writing for like Christian evangelical fundamentalist newsletters and stuff for like a year now. There's quite a lot of this stuff is like in the background. It's coming together, and they're becoming more and more blatant about it because the media is failing to expose them or really like ask questions when, you know, like these supposedly radical feminists turn up writing articles and reviews for a paper that's like, this is why we should legalize spanking more, and like why we should, you know, criminalize abortion and homosexuality. And then you like got all these gender critical feminists who are like participating in that. So there's this wonderful world that, because the media isn't holding them to account at this point, it's surely, in my opinion, going to end up just getting more and more like perverse and absurd. And we're going to have people like, obviously we've got Debbie Hayton now turning up at far right protests, but it's going to get weirder, and sooner or later it's got to crumble.
Yeah, these things tend to become harder and harder to self-sustain as they do get less and less normal. And I mean, we're already pretty far down that track by the looks of it. Every week there's something surprising.
Always
That's very
more fun
funny.
news on Normal Island.
Well, this is the thing. Okay, so this is the thing. Okay, I grew up in Northern Ireland. I still live in Northern Ireland. Most of my life, Northern Irish news and politics and people, like our most normal people, were ridiculous compared to what's going on in Great Britain. But the last 5 years have totally flipped that, and it's been a great time. It's been a great time being able to come home at the end of the day, to look at the BBC News for Northern Ireland, and it be the actually more predictable and understandable and reasonable thing. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I've started looking at my Irish passport in my drawer a little bit more often.
Yeah, pretty good. It's pretty good. I mean, we don't have a government, so it's a bit quiet right now. But
I mean, to be honest, have you seen our government? Like that's sounds like heaven.
it's pretty good.
I could deal without a government for a bit.
It could be nice. Look,
But no government, the one that actively hates you.
Yeah, how about permanently no government? That sounds alright as well, actually.
Could be an interesting one. Thank you ever so much for joining. I think we're going to take a comfort break. If any of you ever want to pop on again, if there's something that's important for you and you want to chat stuff, you're always very welcome. And hopefully the TV broadcast system that we use here, shout out to Video Ninja for working so well and not crashing once and not making anybody look like LSD video. We had a great time. We discovered anarchism right at the very end. So hopefully people learned a thing or two. All in. But chat, if you'd like to say thank you to the folks who came here. This will be, I'll cut this for YouTube and I'll send it over to TSN as well so they can do whatever they want with it with a high quality edit. And I'll stick it up on the YouTube as well. And if you've joined Twitch just to be in chat for this, my apologies, but welcome.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much,
Thank you.
chat. Thank you so much, Alan.
Thanks, chat.
Pleasure. No worries at all. Right, well, we'll take a comfort break, and on the way back, on the other side of it, I guess we'll play some GeoGuessr. If any of our guests like road signs, you're very welcome to stay.
I'll be hanging around
well
for
into that.
GeoGuessr.
Fantastic. Well, we have a bit of a country streak going at about 100 and 110. So
Nice.
Wow.
we'll keep going. That's right. Thank you ever so much, everybody. I'll see you in just a few minutes. There'll be some bops in the meantime. Don't go. Oh God, I moved my BRB in the. Don't go too far.